The Zelthari war fleet moved through the darkness of space like a swarm of metal locusts, 200 ships strong, each one bristling with weapons that had crushed dozens of civilizations before. High Commander Vecthar stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars shift as they entered the new system. His four eyes gleamed with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The Zelthari Dominion had been expanding for 3 centuries, and every species they encountered had either surrendered immediately or been destroyed within days. This new species called humans would be no different. The scout reports had been clear. The system ahead contained one small orbital station and a handful of mining colonies on the inner planets. Nothing that could threaten even a single Zelthari warship, let alone 200. Vecthar had argued that sending such a large fleet was unnecessary, but the Dominion Council wanted to make a statement. They wanted these humans to see overwhelming force and understand that resistance was pointless. As the fleet crossed into human territory, sensors detected the station almost immediately. It was a modest structure, maybe 300 meters across, with old-style weapon platforms attached to its outer ring. Vecthar studied the tactical display and felt something close to disappointment. This would be over before it even began. On the human station designated Frontier 7, Commander Kyle Preston was having a normal day until the alarm started screaming. He was a tall man with short brown hair going gray at the temples and eyes that had seen enough of space to know when something was seriously wrong. He rushed to the command center where his crew of 40 personnel were already at their stations. Lieutenant Amy Walsh looked up from her console with wide eyes. She was young, maybe 25, with red hair tied back in a regulation bun. Her voice was steady despite the fear Kyle could see in her face. "Commander, we have multiple contacts at the system edge, counting over 200 vessels. Unknown design. They just appeared out of nowhere." Kyle felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression calm. 200 ships. His station had maybe a dozen functional weapon platforms and shields that were meant to stop asteroids, not military-grade weapons. He walked to the command chair and sat down slowly, buying himself time to think. "Classification? Unknown, sir. Computer doesn't recognize the design. They're big, though. Capital ship-sized, and they're heading straight for us." Kyle nodded and touched the communications panel. "Open a channel. All frequencies. Make sure they can hear us." Amy's fingers danced across her console. "Channel open, sir." Kyle took a breath and spoke clearly. "Attention unidentified vessels. You have entered sovereign human space without authorization. You are ordered to halt your advance immediately and state your intentions. This is your only warning. Failure to comply will be met with defensive action." The message went out across all standard frequencies, encoded in the basic mathematical language that most spacefaring species could understand. Kyle waited, watching the tactical display as the alien fleet continued its steady advance. They didn't slow down. They didn't change course. They just kept coming. 5 minutes later, the response came. The main view screen flickered to life, and Kyle found himself staring at something that looked like a nightmare. The creature had 4 eyes arranged in a square pattern on its face, gray-scaled skin, and a mouth full of teeth that looked designed for tearing meat. When it spoke, the computer translated the words into flat, emotionless English. "I am High Commander Vecthar of the Zelthari Dominion. This system now belongs to us. You will surrender your station and all colonies immediately. Your species will submit to Dominion authority. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of all human assets in this system and the elimination of your species. You have 1 hour to comply." The transmission ended. Kyle stared at the blank screen for a moment, then looked around at his crew. Every face showed the same mix of fear and anger. They were station personnel, trained to handle pirates and smugglers, not an invasion fleet. But they were still human, and humans didn't just roll over. Kyle opened the channel again. His voice was harder this time, with an edge that made several crew members sit up straighter. "Commander Vecthar, you have been warned. This is human space. You are not authorized to be here. Turn your fleet around and leave immediately. This is your final warning. There will not be another." He closed the channel and turned to Amy. "Send the priority alpha signal. All channels. Full encryption." Amy hesitated, her hand hovering over the controls. Priority alpha was the code that meant only one thing: an invasion. A real threat. The kind of threat that required the full response of human military forces. Once that signal went out, there was no taking it back. "Sir, are you sure?" That signal will bring every fleet within 10 systems. It will start a war. Kyle looked at the tactical display where 200 enemy ships were spreading out into an attack formation. Lieutenant, they started the war when they ignored our warning. Send the signal. Amy pressed the sequence. Throughout human space, secure channels lit up with the emergency code. At military bases and hidden defense stations, crews who had been on routine duty suddenly went to full combat alert. Admirals and generals received the notification and immediately began reviewing the tactical data streaming in from Frontier 7. And in the message, buried in the encrypted data, were 3 simple words that every human commander understood. Warning was given. Vecthar watched his tactical display as his fleet moved into position around the human station. His weapons officer reported that all ships were ready to fire. His shield technician confirmed that defensive screens were at maximum. Everything was proceeding exactly as it always did. Soon the humans would realize their situation was hopeless and they would surrender, and if they didn't, well, destroying the station would send an even clearer message to the rest of their species. Commander, his sensor officer said, I'm detecting unusual energy signatures throughout the system. Multiple locations. They weren't there before. Vecthar glanced at the report but didn't see anything concerning. Probably just the humans powering up their pathetic defense systems. Maintain course. Prepare to fire on my command. What Vecthar didn't know, what he couldn't know because his species had never encountered anything like it, was that humans had learned a very specific lesson from their own bloody history. The lesson was this. Sometimes the best weapons are the ones your enemy never sees until it's too late. Hidden throughout the system were weapons platforms that had been disguised as asteroids, as debris, as random chunks of ice and rock. They had been dormant, waiting, invisible to all but the most sophisticated sensors, and now responding to the priority alpha signal. They were waking up. Kyle watched his secondary display as one by one, hidden assets throughout the system changed status from dormant to active. He felt no satisfaction, no excitement, just a cold certainty about what was coming. He had given them a warning. He had given them 2 warnings. They had ignored both. Now they would learn why humans only warn once. Admiral Henry Cooper was sitting in his office at Frontier Command when the alert came through. He was 58 years old with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many battles. The priority alpha signal made his blood run cold because he knew exactly what it meant. Someone had ignored a human warning. He stood up and walked quickly to the command center where his staff was already assembling the tactical data. Lieutenant Greg Barnes met him at the door. He was a young officer, smart and capable, but he had never seen real combat. Sir, we have the full report from Frontier 7, 200 Zelthari warships. Commander Preston issued 2 warnings. Both were ignored. The Zelthari commander has demanded our surrender. Henry walked to the main display and studied the enemy formation. 200 ships. It was a significant force, but not overwhelming. Not for humanity. Not anymore. What do we know about the Zelthari? Not much, sir. First contact. Our computers have no record of their species. But based on their formation and approach, they're following standard conquest doctrine. They show up with overwhelming force and expect immediate surrender. Henry nodded slowly. He had seen this before. Species that had expanded through intimidation rather than actual fighting. They were dangerous because they had numbers and firepower, but they usually didn't know what to do when someone fought back. Where are our nearest assets? Greg pulled up a strategic map. Battlegroup Orion is 2 jumps away. Battlegroup Pegasus is 3 jumps. We can have 400 ships in position within 30 minutes. 400, Henry repeated. He looked at the younger officer. And they have 200? Seems like overkill, doesn't it? Greg looked confused. Sir, I thought we wanted to be sure. Oh, we'll be sure, Henry said quietly. But that's not why we're sending 400 ships. We're sending 400 ships because we want every species in this part of the galaxy to see what happens when you ignore a human warning. We're sending a message that's written in burning wreckage. Get me fleet command. Full deployment. Authorization code Terminus. Greg's face went pale. Protocol Terminus meant no negotiation, no second chances, complete elimination of the threat. Sir, shouldn't we at least try to communicate? Maybe they didn't understand the warning. Maybe it was a translation error. Henry turned to look at him and his eyes were hard as steel. Lieutenant, do you know why humans only give 1 warning? No, sir. Because we spent 10,000 years fighting each other. We know exactly how deadly we are. We know what our weapons can do. We know what war costs, so when we tell someone to back off, we mean it. We don't bluff. We don't exaggerate. We simply state facts. Commander Preston told them twice. Twice. They chose to ignore it. Now they learned the price of that choice. Within minutes, the orders went out. 6 human fleets began converging on Frontier 7. These weren't defense monitors or patrol ships. These were warships built after humanity's most devastating conflicts. Ships designed by people who understood that the best way to prevent war was to be so terrifyingly effective at it that no one wanted to fight you. Ships crewed by men and women who had trained for years in tactics developed through centuries of human warfare. Captain Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of her carrier, the Retribution, as it dropped out of jump space at the edge of the Frontier 7 system. She was 32 years old, dark-haired, and had the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how good she was at her job. Her ship carried 200 fighter craft, and she had the best pilots in the fleet. Status report. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Danny Wright, pulled up the display. Enemy fleet is in position around Frontier 7. They're in a standard siege formation. Our forces are arriving now. Total count 412 vessels. Lisa studied the enemy positions. The Zelthari had spread out their ships to surround the station, probably thinking it made them look more intimidating. What it actually did was make them vulnerable to concentrated attacks. They had no unified defensive line, no interlocking fields of fire. It was the formation of a species that had never faced serious resistance. Have they been hailed? No, ma'am. Admiral Cooper's orders are clear. No communication. No warning. They had their chance. Lisa nodded and opened the fleet command channel. All ships, this is Retribution. Execute Attack Plan Delta. Fighter wings launch in 30 seconds. Targets are enemy capital ships. Focus fire doctrine. No survivors. Across the human fleet, carrier bays opened and fighters began streaming out. Cruisers and destroyers moved into attack positions. Electronic warfare ships began jamming Zelthari communications and sensors. And on every ship, every station, every gun platform, humans prepared to do what they had always done best. Fight. Vecthar was still congratulating himself on how smoothly the operation was going when his sensor officer made a sound of alarm. Commander detecting multiple jump signatures. Incoming vessels. Counting 50, 100, 150. Vecthar turned to look at the display and felt his confidence waver for the first time. Ships were appearing all around his fleet. Human ships, lots of them. How many? Still counting, sir. 200, 250, 300. Commander, they're surrounding us. The tactical display showed the truth. The Zelthari fleet was now completely encircled by human vessels. Vecthar's advantage in numbers had evaporated in seconds. He opened his mouth to order a defensive formation when the human attack began. There was no warning, no hail demanding surrender, no chance to negotiate. The humans simply opened fire. Lisa watched her tactical display as the first wave of fighters reached the Zelthari fleet. The enemy ships tried to respond, but their weapons were designed for ship-to-ship combat, not for dealing with swarms of small, fast-moving targets. Her pilots exploited that weakness ruthlessly, targeting weapons arrays and engine sections. All wings focus on their command ships. Take out their leadership first. The Zelthari flagship, a massive vessel called Pride of Dominion, was buried under a wave of human fighters. Missiles streaked in from a dozen directions. Energy weapons carved through armor plating. The ship's shields, designed to stop heavy weapons, were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of smaller attacks coming from every angle. Vecthar watched in horror as his fleet began to die. Ships exploded one after another, as human cruisers concentrated their fire on single targets until nothing remained but debris. His communications officer tried to coordinate a defense, but human jamming made it impossible. His ships couldn't talk to each other, couldn't coordinate their fire, couldn't even call for help. They were being slaughtered. Open a channel to the humans, Vecthar shouted. Offer our surrender. Tell them we'll withdraw immediately. His communications officer tried every frequency, every protocol. Nothing worked. The humans weren't responding. They weren't even acknowledging the hails. They were just killing methodically and efficiently, working their way through the Zelthari fleet ship by ship. One of Vecthar's younger officers, a female named Shara, spoke quietly. They warned us, Commander. They said failure to comply would be met with defensive action. They told us twice. Vecthar turned to stare at her. The reality of what was happening crashed over him like a wave. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution. The humans had given them a chance, and he had thrown it away because he thought they were weak, because he thought 200 ships was an unstoppable force, because he had never met a species that actually meant what they said. The pride of Dominion shook as human torpedoes found their mark. Shields collapsed. Hull plating buckled. Bekthar had time for one final thought before the bridge exploded around him. They warned us. The battle lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. When it was over, the space around Frontier 7 was filled with debris and the broken hulls of Zelthari warships. Not a single enemy vessel remained capable of fighting. Some were completely destroyed. Nothing but expanding clouds of metal and gas. Others were crippled, drifting in space with their engines dead and life support failing. The human fleet had taken minimal damage. 7 ships reported hits, none critical, 0 destroyed. Admiral Henry Cooper stood on the bridge of his flagship Valiant and watched the tactical display update as damage reports came in. He felt tired, not physically, but the deep weariness that came from doing something necessary but terrible. He had just ordered the destruction of an entire fleet. 40,000 Zelthari had died in the last 4 hours. 40,000 beings who had made the mistake of following orders from a commander who didn't understand what a human warning meant. Lieutenant Greg Barnes approached carefully. The young officer looked shaken. He had watched the battle from the command center, and now he was seeing the aftermath. Hundreds of life pods drifting among the wreckage. Distress signals on every frequency. Sir, we're receiving surrender requests from surviving Zelthari vessels. They're asking for rescue and medical aid. Some of their life support systems are failing. If we don't help them soon, they'll die. Henry nodded slowly. Render assistance. Deploy rescue teams to all vessels showing life signs. Full medical support. Treat them exactly as you would treat human casualties. Greg looked surprised. Sir, after what we just did? After Protocol Terminus? Henry turned to look at him, and his voice was patient but firm. Listen carefully, Lieutenant, because this is important. We are not monsters. We are not murderers. We are humans. Yes, we destroyed their fleet. Yes, we killed 40,000 of them. But that was war. That was them ignoring a clear warning, and us following through on the consequences we promised. The battle is over now. They are no longer a threat. They are prisoners. And humans treat prisoners with dignity and respect. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Greg said quietly. Good. And Lieutenant, make sure every single Zelthari survivor understands exactly why this happened. Make sure they know we gave them a choice. Make sure they know we meant every word of our warning. Make sure they know that humans don't bluff. Over the next several hours, human rescue teams worked through the wreckage, pulling out survivors. Medical ships deployed to provide treatment. Engineers stabilized failing life support systems. The Zelthari who were rescued expected torture or execution. That's what the Dominion would have done. Instead, they found themselves in clean medical bays being treated by human doctors who worked to save their lives with the same dedication they would show to human patients. Commander Kyle. Preston watched the rescue operations from his station. His crew was helping coordinate the effort, directing rescue ships to vessels that still had survivors. He had been at his post for over 12 hours straight, and he was exhausted. But there was one more thing he needed to do. Amy Walsh brought him a cup of coffee and sat down next to him. She looked as tired as he felt. Commander, the last survivors are being recovered now. Total count is 3,142, out of a fleet of 40,000. Kyle closed his eyes for a moment. 3,000 survivors out of 40,000. The mathematics have ignored warnings. Prepare a message. I want it broadcast to every Zelthari prisoner. Translate it into their language. Repeat it every 6 hours until we send them home. What do you want to say, sir? Kyle thought for a moment, then began speaking. Amy recorded his words, her fingers moving across her console as she set up the broadcast parameters. The message went out an hour later. Every Zelthari survivor, whether they were in medical bays or detention facilities, received it. The translation was clear and precise. There was no room for misunderstanding. I am Commander Kyle Preston of Frontier Station 7. You entered our space without permission. You were given a warning. You were told to halt your advance and state your intentions. You were informed that failure to comply would be met with defensive action. You chose to ignore that warning. Your commander demanded our surrender and threatened to destroy us. The consequences of those choices are the destroyed fleet that surrounds you. Kyle paused in the recording. making sure his next words were clear and unmistakable. Humans do not repeat warnings. When we tell you something, we mean it. We do not bluff. We do not make empty threats. We state facts and allow you to make your choices based on those facts. You were warned. You ignored the warning. Now you know what happens when humans are ignored. Another pause. This next part was important. This was the part that would determine whether this happened again. You will be returned to your territory with this message for your leaders. Human space is not to be entered without authorization. Any hostile act will be met with immediate and overwhelming force. There will be no second warnings, no negotiations, no chances to surrender. You had your warning. You ignored it. Learn from that mistake. The recording ended. Kyle sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He hoped the message was clear enough. He hoped the Zelthari would understand and spread the word to other species, because he really didn't want to do this again. 3 days later, the Zelthari survivors were loaded onto automated transport ships. They had been given medical treatment, food, and basic supplies. The ships were programmed to take them directly back to Dominion space. Along with the survivors went complete tactical data of the battle. Visual records showing the destruction of the fleet, sensor logs documenting human weapons capabilities, and Kyle's message stored in every format the Zelthari used. Lisa Morgan watched the transport ships jump away and felt a mix of emotions. Relief that it was over, sadness at the loss of life, pride in her crew who had performed brilliantly, and hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the last time they needed to teach this particular lesson. Her tactical officer, Danny, came to stand beside her. "Captain, do you think they'll listen? Do you think they'll spread the word?" Lisa thought about the 3,000 Zelthari who were heading home. 3,000 beings who had survived because humans showed mercy after the battle. 3,000 witnesses who would tell their story to anyone who would listen. "I think they'll talk. Whether anyone listens is another question. But we did our part. We gave them a warning. We gave them a choice. What they do with that information is up to them." Back at Frontier Command, Admiral Henry Cooper was writing his report. He documented every decision, every order, every casualty. The report would be reviewed by Fleet Command and eventually by civilian leadership. Some would question whether Protocol Terminus had been necessary. Some would argue that they should have tried harder to communicate. Henry was prepared to defend every choice he had made. But as he wrote, he kept coming back to one simple fact. Commander Preston had given them a warning. A clear, explicit warning with no room for misunderstanding. The Zelthari commander had ignored it. Everything that happened after that moment was a direct consequence of that choice. Humans had learned long ago that the only thing more dangerous than making threats you can't back up was making threats you weren't willing to back up. So humans didn't make threats. They made promises. And they kept those promises no matter how terrible the cost. The Zelthari transport ships arrived in Dominion space 8 days after leaving Frontier 7. They came in slowly, broadcasting distress signals and identification codes that hadn't been used in over a century. The codes that meant a military disaster. The codes that meant most of the fleet was gone. The Dominion High Council convened an emergency session within hours. They gathered in their traditional chamber, a vast room with crystalline walls that refracted light into rainbow patterns. Normally it was a place of calm deliberation. Today it felt like a tomb. The 12 council members took their seats and waited as the surviving Zelthari were brought in to give their testimony. Shara, one of Vekthar's tactical officers, stood before the council and told them everything. She described the human warning. She described Vekthar's dismissal of that warning. She described the appearance of the human fleet and the systematic destruction that followed. Her voice remained steady throughout, but her 4 eyes showed the trauma of what she had witnessed. When she finished, the council chamber was silent. Council Elder Thrace spoke first. He was ancient by Zelthari standards, his scales faded to almost white, his eyes clouded with age. "You say the humans warned you twice?" "Yes, Elder. Commander Preston stated clearly that we were entering their space without authorization. He told us to halt and state our intentions. He said failure to comply would be met with defensive action." High Commander Vekthar dismissed the warning. The human commander repeated it. Vekthar ordered the fleet to advance. Another council member, a younger female named Cress, leaned forward. "And the human response? Describe it again." Shara pulled up the tactical recordings and displayed them for the council. The footage showed the human fleet appearing from nowhere. ships materializing in perfect formations, completely surrounding the Zelthari force. Then the attack. Ruthless, efficient, coordinated. The Council watched in silence as 200 Zelthari warships were reduced to wreckage in just over 4 hours. They didn't negotiate, Shara continued. They didn't demand our surrender. They didn't try to communicate at all. They simply attacked. By the time we tried to surrender, they weren't listening. They had stopped acknowledging our transmissions. They just kept firing until our entire fleet was destroyed or disabled. Elder Thrace studied the footage carefully. He had been a military commander himself many decades ago before joining the Council. He understood what he was seeing. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated. Every attack was precise. They targeted command ships first, then support vessels, then the main fleet. They used electronic warfare to blind us and prevent coordination. They employed swarm tactics with their fighters. They concentrated fire to ensure each target was completely destroyed before moving to the next. This was the work of a species that understands war very well. Too well, Cress said quietly. Elder, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Who are these humans? The Council's intelligence officer, a male named Drek, pulled up what little information the Dominion had gathered. Humans are relatively new to space. They've been spacefaring for less than 100 years. By all measures, they should be technologically inferior to most species we've encountered, but their military capabilities are exceptional. The reason appears to be their history. Drek displayed information gathered from various sources, including interrogations of the survivors and analysis of human transmissions. Humans have been fighting each other for their entire recorded history. Over 10,000 years of continuous warfare. They didn't develop their weapons for space combat. They developed them for killing other humans. What we saw at Frontier 7 wasn't a defense fleet. It was their military doctrine applied to a new environment. The Council members exchanged glances. A species that had spent 10,000 years fighting itself. The implications were staggering. Most spacefaring civilizations achieved space travel after uniting their homeworlds. After moving past war and conflict, humans had apparently just taken their wars with them to the stars. Elder Thrace spoke again. They warned us. That's the key point here. They gave us a chance to withdraw. Vecthar chose to ignore that chance. The question now is what we do with this information. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some Council members argued for revenge, for assembling a larger fleet and returning to human space. Others pointed out that the humans had sent the survivors home with a message. That message was clear. Stay out of human space or face the same consequences. The question was whether the Dominion should heed that message or test it. In the end, Elder Thrace made the decision. His voice carried the weight of authority that came with centuries of experience. We will not engage with humans again. We will declare their space forbidden to all Dominion vessels. Any ship that violates this order will be destroyed by our own forces, because I will not give the humans a reason to demonstrate their capabilities a second time. But Thrace went further. He ordered that all information about the encounter be shared with every species the Dominion had contact with. The battle recordings, the tactical analysis, Commander Preston's message, everything. If we suffered this defeat because we didn't understand what we were dealing with, then we have a responsibility to ensure others don't make the same mistake. The information spread quickly. Within weeks, dozens of species had received the data. Within months, hundreds. The footage of the battle was analyzed in military academies across known space. Strategists studied human tactics. Politicians debated what it meant to have such a warlike species joining the galactic community. And everywhere, the same question was asked. What kind of species only gives one warning? The answer came from an unlikely source. A Cavrian diplomat named Zek, who specialized in human culture, had spent years studying Earth's history. He was invited to speak at a galactic security conference 6 months after the Frontier 7 incident. His presentation was titled Understanding Human Warning Doctrine, and it drew representatives from over 50 species. Zek stood at the podium and began with a simple statement. Humans only give one warning because they understand the cost of war better than any species in known space. Let me explain. He displayed images from Earth's history, battlefields that had claimed millions of lives, cities reduced to rubble, weapons that could destroy entire continents. Humans fought each other with terrifying intensity for thousands of years. They developed weapons of incredible destructive power. At one point in their history, They possessed enough nuclear weapons to render their entire planet uninhabitable. They came within minutes of actually doing so on several occasions. The audience listened in shocked silence. Several species had developed nuclear weapons, but none had built enough to threaten their entire world. The concept was incomprehensible to most. But they didn't destroy themselves, Zek continued. They stepped back from that edge. They learned through incredible cost that the only way to prevent war was to make the consequences of war so clear, so terrible, so inevitable, that no rational actor would choose it. That's what a human warning is. It's not a threat. It's a statement of fact. It's them saying, here is what will happen if you continue. We are giving you this information so you can make an informed choice. He pulled up Commander Preston's warning. Look at the language. You are ordered to halt. This is your only warning. Failure to comply will be met with defensive action. Nothing ambiguous. Nothing threatening. Just facts. This is what we need you to do. This is what happens if you don't do it. Choose. Zek let that sink in before continuing. The Zelthari High Commander chose to ignore the warning. From the human perspective, that was a clear statement of hostile intent, so they responded exactly as they had promised. Defensive action, immediate, overwhelming, final. And then after the battle, they treated the survivors with dignity and medical care. Because humans separate the battle from the aftermath. During the battle, they are utterly ruthless. After the battle, they are bound by their own codes of conduct regarding prisoners. A delegate from the Threxian Confederation raised a tentacle. But surely this makes them too dangerous. A species that fights like this cannot be trusted. Zek shook his head. You're missing the point. Humans can absolutely be trusted. That's what the warning system demonstrates. They tell you exactly what they will do. They don't lie. They don't exaggerate. They don't bluff. If they say something will happen, it happens. The Zelthari incident proves this. Commander Preston said failure to comply would be met with defensive action. It was. Humans are perhaps the most trustworthy species I've studied because their words and actions align perfectly. The conference continued for 3 days. By the end, a consensus had emerged. Humans were dangerous, yes, but they were predictably dangerous. As long as you listened to their warnings, as long as you respected their boundaries, they were no threat. But ignore them, dismiss them, treat their warnings as empty threats, and you would learn the same lesson the Zelthari had learned. 2 years after the Frontier 7 incident, humanity received an invitation to join the Galactic Council as a full member. The invitation came with detailed protocols about how to approach Council space, which channels to use for communication, and a request that human warships remain outside the neutral zone during the initial meetings. Every instruction was followed precisely. The humans understood that first impressions mattered. Ambassador Patricia Coleman was chosen to represent humanity at the council. She was 50 years old, a career diplomat who had spent decades negotiating treaties between Earth nations before moving into interstellar relations. She understood power dynamics, and she understood that humans were walking into a room where everyone knew about Frontier 7, where everyone had seen the footage, where everyone was trying to decide if humans were potential allies or existential threats. The council chamber was impressive. Representatives from 200 species gathered in a vast circular room with translation technology that allowed everyone to understand everyone else. Patricia walked to the human delegation section and took her seat. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, some curious, some fearful, some calculating. The council chairman, a being called High Speaker Morvan from a species called the Trillari, opened the session. We welcome the human delegation to this council. Before we proceed with formal membership discussions, there are questions that must be addressed, specifically regarding the incident at Frontier 7. Patricia stood. Her voice was calm and professional. Of course, High Speaker. We are prepared to answer any questions the council may have. A representative from the Cavrian Union spoke first. Ambassador Coleman, your species destroyed an entire fleet. 40,000 beings died. Can you justify such extreme action? Patricia didn't hesitate. The Zelthari fleet entered human space without authorization. They were warned twice to withdraw. They refused. They demanded our surrender and threatened complete destruction of our assets. Under those circumstances, yes, our response was justified. We defended our territory against an invasion force. Another representative, this one from the Sindari Collective, raised a concern. But couldn't you have disabled their ships without destroying them? Couldn't you have used non-lethal force? We could have, Patricia acknowledged. But that would have required them to stop after we disabled the first few ships, to recognize that we were capable of defeating them and to choose withdrawal. They had already demonstrated that they wouldn't stop when warned. We had no reason to believe they would stop after taking casualties, so we eliminated the threat completely. High Speaker Morven leaned forward. And the survivors? Why did you treat them with such care after destroying their fleet? Patricia met his gaze directly. Because the battle was over. They were no longer a threat. Humans have rules about how we treat prisoners and wounded. Those rules don't change based on who the enemy is or what they did. Once someone surrenders or is no longer capable of fighting, they are entitled to medical care and humane treatment. Always. There was a long pause as the council members processed this. Finally, a representative from the Quinn Federation asked the question many were thinking. Are all human warnings like the one given at Frontier 7? Do humans always respond with such overwhelming force? Yes, Patricia said simply. When we give a warning, we mean it. We don't bluff. We don't make empty threats. If we tell you that an action will have consequences, those consequences will occur exactly as described. This isn't unique to military situations. In trade, in diplomacy, in any interaction, humans say what we mean and mean what we say. Elder Thrace, who had traveled from Zelthari space specifically for this meeting, spoke up. His voice carried across the chamber. I have studied the humans extensively since the Frontier 7 incident. I believe I understand what makes them different. Most species develop faster than light travel after achieving peace on their homeworlds, after uniting under common cause. Humans achieved spaceflight while still divided into hundreds of competing nations. They took their wars with them to space. Every weapon they possess, every tactic they use was developed for fighting other humans. When they warn you, they are drawing on 10,000 years of experience about what happens when warnings are ignored. Patricia nodded. Elder Thrace is correct. We know what war costs because we've paid that price countless times. We know what happens when communication breaks down, when threats are dismissed, when conflict spirals out of control. That's why we try so hard to prevent it. That's why we give clear warnings. That's why we follow through on what we say. Because we understand, perhaps better than any other species, that the alternative is worse. The debate continued for hours. Some council members remained skeptical. Others were openly hostile to the idea of admitting humans as full members. But slowly a consensus began to form. Humans were dangerous, but they were also predictable. Their warning system, while harsh, was at least clear and consistent. And their treatment of prisoners showed that they weren't simply violent for its own sake. 3 days later, the council voted. Humanity was accepted as a full member with only 12 votes against. Along with membership came certain requirements. Humans had to establish clear boundaries for their space and communicate those boundaries to all council species. They had to agree to warning protocols that gave other species time to withdraw before military action. And they had to participate in joint security operations under council authority. Patricia agreed to all of it. The terms were reasonable, and humans had always intended to follow them anyway. 6 months after joining the council, an incident occurred that tested the new relationship. A species called the Vortan Hegemony, who were not council members, sent a military expedition into human space. They claimed they were looking for resources and didn't recognize human territorial boundaries. They ignored the automated warnings at the border. They ignored direct communications from the nearest human station. They continued advancing. The human response was swift but measured. A single cruiser, the Defender, intercepted the Vortan ships. Commander Blake Harris opened a channel and delivered the warning. Vortan vessels, you are in violation of human space. Withdraw immediately or you will be fired upon. This is your only warning. The Vortan commander laughed. He had heard stories about human warnings, but he thought they were exaggerated. He had 30 ships. The humans had sent one. He continued his advance. Commander Harris waited exactly 60 seconds. Then he opened fire. The Defender was one of humanity's newer vessels, equipped with weapons that had been upgraded after Frontier 7. It disabled all 30 Vortan ships in under 20 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Weapons knocked out, engines crippled, but life support intact. Harris then broadcast a message. Vortan Commander, your ships are disabled. You were warned. You chose to ignore that warning. Rescue vessels are being dispatched to provide medical aid and return you to your territory. The next time a human gives you a warning, I suggest you listen. The incident was reported to the Galactic Council. Patricia appeared before them to explain. The Vortan ships were disabled, not destroyed, because they posed a limited threat. A single cruiser was sufficient to neutralize them. Had they been a larger force, our response would have been proportional to that threat. But the principle remains the same. We warned them. They ignored the warning. They faced the consequences. High Speaker Morvan studied the tactical data, and if they had withdrawn after the first few ships were disabled, then we would have escorted them out of human space and the incident would have ended there, Patricia said. We are not interested in causing casualties. We are interested in defending our territory. Those are not the same thing. The Council accepted the explanation. More importantly, so did the rest of the galaxy. The Vortan incident became another teaching moment. Another demonstration that humans meant what they said. Word spread further and faster than before. Within a year, approaching human space became the safest it had ever been. Ships announced themselves clearly. They requested permission to enter. They followed designated routes. They respected boundaries. Because everyone understood the alternative. Everyone had seen what happened when humans were ignored. Commander Kyle Preston, still stationed at Frontier 7, watched as a trade convoy from the Trillari passed through his system. They had filed their flight plan in advance, communicated at every checkpoint, and followed every regulation perfectly. He smiled. This was what he had hoped for. Not fear but respect. Not avoidance but proper protocol. Lieutenant Peter Graham, who had joined the station crew a year ago, came to stand beside him. Sir, do you think it will last? This peace? Kyle thought about that question. He thought about the Zeltari fleet burning in space. He thought about the 3,000 survivors he had sent home. He thought about every species that had heard the story and changed their approach to human space. I think it will last as long as we remain consistent. As long as we keep our promises. As long as people understand that when a human gives a warning, it means something. And if someone tests it again, then we'll give them a warning, Kyle said quietly. Once, and hope they're smarter than the last ones. 10 years after Frontier 7, the incident had become legendary.